Everyone, to Johns Hopkins SAIS. Really happy today to have Declan Walsh with us for a conversation about his new book. Declan is the chief Africa correspondent for the New York Times, previously Cairo bureau chief, previously Pakistan bureau chief. He has reported from all over the world and wrote a really intriguing book about his time in Pakistan. I first met Declan years ago in Islamabad and am really delighted that he's here to unpack some of his experiences in Pakistan. This is the sort of book that I would encourage all of you to buy. It's available online in physical form and on Kindle. And if you know a lot about Pakistan, this book really fills in some terrific details and nuances about the important people and events over a really tumultuous period in Pakistan's recent history. If you don't know very much about Pakistan, the virtue of this book is that it also gives you a really textured history of Pakistan's founding, Pakistan's challenges, particularly in sort of the political and security space, and some of the colorful characters that inhabit it. So I'd encourage all of you to buy it. What I'm going to do is to turn it over to Declan for a little while to talk about the origins of the book, what motivated him to write it, and then we'll have a conversation and then open it up to your questions from the Q&A function, which you can use at the bottom of your screen. So with that, I will turn it over to Declan to tell us about his book.
Hey, Josh, you can hear me?
I sure can.
Great. Thank you so much for that kind introduction. It's a real honor to be speaking at even virtually at SAIS today. When I was in Pakistan, I drew a lot on the scholarly resources of SAIS, starting with Vali Nasser, but by no means limited to Vali. So it's great to be here to talk about the book today. I'm going to start off, like you said, by just describing a little bit about how I came to write this book in the first place. You know, I came to Pakistan in 2004. At that time, it was not actually the most glamorous assignment for a foreign correspondent, simply because, you know, this was a year after the war had started in Iraq. North of Pakistan and Afghanistan, you had a very kind of dynamic story. The US had sent military forces in there 3 years earlier. Hamid Karzai was in power. There were elections going on. The Taliban were very much a diminished force at that point. They were really on the back burner. And Pakistan was seen as this country at the time that was in this kind of state of, I would call, uneasy equilibrium. It had a military ruler, Pervez Musharraf. He seemed to be pretty much in control of things. He had what appeared to be quite a strong alliance with the United States. But there were a lot of questions about Pakistan. Was it really an ally of the West? You know, what was really the relationship with the Islamist extremists that still seem to be quite strong or seem to have some force in the country? You know, whose side was Pakistan on in broad terms? So I got there and I remember it was not very dynamic, but 2 or 3 years into my stay there, things suddenly started to take off. And, you know, particularly from 2007, there was Pervez Musharraf, the military ruler, faced these protests, street protests that suddenly exploded out of nowhere, took him by surprise, took the country by surprise to a large degree. And it was the start of this chain of events that went on for many years, actually. And so some years into that period, I started thinking about, you know, maybe writing a book, trying to capture some of that, but also provide a sort of springboard for people who weren't so familiar with Pakistan, who might be grappling with some of the issues that I was grappling when I was living with there, trying to reconcile the contradictions of this country. Because if nothing else, I mean, Pakistan is many things. It is many things that are wonderful and that are frightening and enigmatic and, you know, intriguing and mysterious. But it is, if nothing else, it is a country with complexities and contradictions. And when I was there, I spent a lot of my time trying to, you know, unpick what was happening in the news, but also get a sense of like the bigger picture. How do all of these things fit together that I was experiencing as a reporter? So I started, I looked at the literature that was out there, and there were, at the time, a lot of great books had been written about Pakistan, and many more would be written in the years to come by both Pakistani and international authors. So people like Ahmed Rashid had written a great book. Steve Coll, of course, had written The History, Ghost Wars. There were many specialist books on politics and militancy and so on. But to my mind, a lot of those books were really geared towards Pakistan watchers, people like Joshua White, actually, if I can point out, or people like me, people who were kind of already fairly steeped in the country and were really into the weeds of the history and what was going on. And I had been drawn after I got there to a book that was written by an economist correspondent 20 years earlier, a woman called Emma Duncan. And she wrote this book called Breaking the Curfew, that was kind of like this eagle's eye view of the country that had a smattering of things and took the reader really on a journey. You had a sense of going through the country and meeting people, not just the big news events, but also in their homes and in their moments of repose and even in, moments of revelation. And I was really drawn to that model for a book. So I started thinking about that. And I also was drawn to this idea of reaching a broader audience. I kind of liked the idea of a book that would somehow manage to bridge the divide between all the thematic richness of Pakistan and the really dramatic news events that were going on, somehow bridge that, and also the historical context, and to knit this together in a way that it somehow made sense for I kind of imagined, when I was writing stories at the time, I worked for The Guardian, later I moved to the New York Times, and I often, trying to frame a story, I would imagine a reader of the newspaper, someone sitting on the underground in London, going to work, reading a story about Pakistan. And I often use that as a template to try and figure out how much information I needed to give people or what level of explanation they gave. So I kind of thought about a bigger version of that. So that led me to, eventually that led to The Nine Lives. And very briefly, The Nine Lives is a book that zooms in on this very combustible period I covered Pakistan, from the mid-2000s, more or less until the mid-2010s, 2014, 15. I was expelled from the country in 2013, and it goes on for some years after that. There's a broader frame. It draws heavily on the history all the way back to partition in 1947, but really it is centered on the great dramas that played out, starting really with Pervez Musharraf, the rise of Musharraf, the fall of Musharraf, leading to the return of the opposition leader Benazir Bhutto, her assassination only 2 or 3 months later, leading on to the Taliban insurgency that swept across the country for several years. And then, of course, the American operation to locate and kill Osama bin Laden in 2011, that in many ways was a turning point. So in the relationship, at least between the US and Pakistan. So it zooms in on this period, and it is framed around, as the title suggests, 9 Pakistanis who lived through that period. And these are people who are in most cases, I think, very colorful characters, and I sort of use their lives. They're colorful characters, and they are people who lived, in most cases, sort of on the cutting edge of the big events that were going on around them. They're not, for the most part, the principal characters in the country. They're not the Musharrafs or the Benazirs, actually. They're people sort of a rung or two down. They're, in most cases, they're people I knew fairly well while I lived there, some of whom I met afterwards. And they are people who, I use the lives, I tell the story of their lives during that period to tell a good story, hopefully, but also to flesh out the broader issues that have afflicted Pakistan and bedeviled its progress really since its creation in 1947. So issues around the role of religion, the role of Islam, obviously, the treatment of minorities, the power struggles between military and civilian leaders, issues of identity, of ethnic groups in the regions, all of these issues that sort of flow through everything that I was writing about then about Pakistan, and in fact these are issues that still flow through stories about Pakistan now. And then the other aspect of the book is that there's an element of a mystery. I was expelled from Pakistan in 2013 during the election. And this election was, in many ways, seen as this incredibly positive moment for Pakistan. Pervez Musharraf, the military leader, had been forced from power 5 years earlier. The country had just gone through a civilian government that had certainly experienced its share of turbulence, but had gotten to the end of its term. Now they were holding an election and they were about to hand over power peacefully to another civilian government, or so it appeared. And so this election was in many ways this great moment of hope. And yet 3 days before the poll was due to take place, or 2 days before the poll was due to take place rather, I got a bunch of police and I think intelligence people came to my door in Islamabad at midnight with this letter that simply said, your visa to Pakistan is hereby cancelled on account of what it called my undesirable activities, and you have 72 hours to leave the country. So, I mean, this is recounted in some detail in the book, but basically I tried to get this decision rescinded somewhat naively. I went off, did some reporting on the election, got picked up, and I was held in a hotel for 12 hours until I was driven to the airport in Lahore and unceremoniously put on a flight. So that my expulsion was a hard event for me. Obviously, I'd lived in the country for 9 years at that point, but it was also a bit of a moment of revelation when I stood back about when I thought about how do things really work in Pakistan. And it got me, in a way, it really was the spur that got the book moving, having been sort of in gestation for quite a while before that. There was an element of mystery for me. I wanted to find out what were these undesirable activities that were pressing enough for the government to want to kick me out? And also, if I could find an answer to that, what did that tell you more broadly about how Pakistan works? So when I got down, just very briefly on the structuring of the book, when I started thinking about a book, I was drawn initially to the idea of some of the things I've just spoken about, the enduring themes of Pakistan and the way that they play out. So I had considered writing a book that would be divided into sections about politics, the military, maybe society, some of the provincial insurgencies that had been going on and so on. And I pushed through that, but then as I started writing drafts, I realized that this was a little bit of a dry approach. I wasn't sure it was going to serve the sort of readers that I wanted to reach. I thought maybe I'm going down the road I wanted to avoid of writing a slightly specialist book. And I started to think about how I had really felt that I was starting to come to terms with Pakistan, or to get a grip. Whether I was right or not is for other people to judge, but I remember there were moments when I felt, okay, I'm starting to get the hang of this place. I'm starting to understand some things about it. And I realized that the most salient moments for me were usually through often sort of informal encounters with people, not often with the big figures like Musharraf or even Benazir and so on, colorful as they were. But it tended to be more with these other people, politicians, lower ranking members of the military or even intelligence services, if we could reach them, human rights activists, people who were sort of on the front line of the dramas, but were not necessarily the leaders. And, one of the great things, Pakistan, as I say, is this country that has clearly during this period presented a lot of challenges for a reporter. There were difficulties with access, parts of the country were blocked off, and it increasingly became a dangerous place to work because of this insurgency that was gathering steam. And Islamabad, when I arrived there, was this sleepy city where people used to make jokes about how sappiferous it was. And, there was a joke that when I arrived there, people were telling me, what's the difference between Pakistan and a New York graveyard? And it was like, well, or Islamabad and a New York graveyard. And the answer was, well, Islamabad is, half the size and twice as dead. So, it was really this sleepy place, but suddenly it started becoming very lively, to use euphemism, and quite dangerous. Bombs were going off, even in Islamabad, even in the pretty salubrious part of the city that I lived in. So but I did start to, what I was getting at was, but the positive side of, one of the many positives of working there was that I realized that there were a lot of Pakistanis who were willing to give access to a reporter like me, this kind of like curious outsider who would turn up or knock on their door, often through a recommendation through another person. I realized this was a big key to getting things done over there. And I kept finding myself bumping into these people who were, incredibly colorful and often kind of entertaining, and lived these wild lives, on the edge of things. And they were willing to let me in and to give me access to sort of hang out with them and see how they did business or what went on in their lives. And, one of the first instances where I really realized I was kind of onto a good thing in Pakistan in that respect was I was in Peshawar, and a friend recommended that I go and see this politician who nobody had heard of internationally, or even in Pakistan, was not a well-known man. His name was Anwar Kamal Khan. And he was this politician from, a very far-flung part of Northwest Frontier Province, as it was known then, called Lucky Merwith, impoverished. The land was pretty barren, most of it, and it was on the border with the tribal areas, with Waziristan. And Anwar Kamal Marwat was this man who was the local politician. He had trained as a lawyer, but he had, stood for election countless times, pretty much always got elected, and he ran the show down there. And so they said, go and see Anwar Kamal. He's at his house in Peshawar. Like many people in this area, he's got his constituency, but then he has a house in a pretty nice part of Peshawar, the provincial capital. And I'm sitting in his living room, and he turned up. He's this sort of rotund man with a twirly mustache, and he disappeared off for a couple of minutes to go and get some refreshments. And I'm sitting in his living room, very classic Pakistani living room, and on the table in front of me, there's a little photo book. It's like sort of album of photos you would normally see pictures of grandchildren in, or family holidays, things like that. I remember it had a Kodak cover. So I pick up this photo book because I'm, nosy, and I start to flip through it. And there are all these photos of, men carrying pretty impressive looking weapons in, tribal clothing, and they're standing in these very dramatic locales, and in many cases Anwar Kamal is standing in the middle of them, and he's cheering and giving thumbs up signs. And there was even one photo of him sitting at the helm of an anti-aircraft gun, a rather old anti-aircraft gun. So when he arrived back in, I said, Anwar Kamal, what is this about? I thought you were a politician. And he said, no. Well, you see, yes, I'm a politician, but also, in our area, we have a lot of rivalries with other groups, and occasionally these rivalries turn to fighting, and, I lead the local lashkar, and this is how we prosecute the rivalries. So we got chatting, and it turned out that Anwar Kamal was, the area where he lived at that time was starting to come under pressure from the Taliban, who were spilling out of Waziristan, the Pakistani Taliban. They were spilling out of Waziristan, and they were starting to kidnap people in his area. So I said, well, that sounds fascinating. And he said, well, why don't you come down and see it for yourself? And then a couple of days later, I found myself in a car on my way down to Lucky Merwith with him. And that was the start of a sort of professional relationship, or a link, if you like, that went on for several years. I kept going back to see him, and he was this man who was willing to be incredibly frank about the sometimes, contentious and brutal ways that things were done in his part of the world, and his role in them, and also in his fight against the Taliban. So I say that by way of just saying, here's part of the sort of people who I eventually would populate this book with, and who also and I think I've worked in quite a few countries as a reporter, and there, so many countries are fascinating to work in. Nearly every country is in its own way, but in not every country do you get that kind of access to people, and that is one of the great things about Pakistan. And that, the reasons for that are many. They are cultural and social and even political. But it is an indisputable fact about Pakistan. One of the reasons why I stayed there for so long and really felt at home in the country in the end. So yeah, that led me to the nine lives, and in many ways, these 9 lives that I've written about, in many cases, their lives well, I will say 2 things about them. One is that, to some degree, the 9 lives represent 9 different Pakistans. I didn't quite set out to write it like that, but when I got to the end, I realized that the sort of experiences that each of them had, their stories, really point to many things about Pakistan, but they also point to the fractured nature of this country. It's got so many different, fault lines, and, these people, in many cases, I felt anyway, epitomize some of those issues. The decisions they took, the stakes that they risked, unfortunately, in many cases, the fates that they suffered. Many of the people I wrote about ultimately died, many of them violently. Spoke volumes about where the country was at then. And the other thing, of course, about them is that while they told separate stories, they also, in many cases, overlapped. And that was one of the challenges in writing the book narratively, to kind of unfurl these stories in a linear way that made sense. But it was also a great joy that you found all of these echoes that hopefully could resonate through the book and enrich the reader's understanding of, hopefully, trying to reach some solution to how this country works. And then lastly, I will just say, I would say two other things. One is that even though many of the events in the book date back 5 or 10 years, or even before, to 15 years, when I was writing it, I really hoped that I would be able to describe these lives and these circumstances, but to also, that the reader would be able to draw lessons from those experiences that really could be applied to any period in Pakistani history or any recent period. And when I look at the country now, I see a lot of echoes of the same sort of issues. I see Nawaz Sharif, opposition leader, prime minister, opposition leader, prime minister, now in the opposition again, in exile in London, facing corruption charges, his daughter rising as a dynast to take his place. I see the struggle between the military and the civilians playing out in new ways. So I hope that in writing this book, it tells people a good story, it tells them about that period, but it also provides them with some tools to look at more recent events. And then, also on that, I will say though, that, you also see in recent events, and I'm happy to talk to you about this perhaps, Josh, how those themes have moved on as well. I mean, we see, blasphemy, the use of the blasphemy, the misuse of the blasphemy laws. I have a whole chapter on that, and things have only gotten worse in the country since then on that. We see now the military having a much stronger hold over the media, certainly, and arguably over politics, that arguably in some ways than they had even during the era of Pervez Musharraf, even though this is a time of civilian rule. But then the other thing that I see when I look around me now in Pakistan is, the other enduring thing I see is the sort of spirited discussion of a lot of these issues in the country, and Pakistanis themselves really grappling with them. I was looking at some photos recently from a Women's Day march, and I was looking at there's been a controversy over the Women's Day march, and of course the Conservatives are against these demonstrations and so on, and I see women holding up these slogans or these placards with slogans like "warm up your own food" and "how do I know where your socks are?" And then the other thing, just earlier today, I was looking at there's a short animated movie or feature that's just been released by a production house in Pakistan. I'm not sure who they are. I apologize. And it's called Swipe. And it's this animated short story about a young boy who becomes addicted to a smartphone app called iFatwa. And iFatwa is this app that sort of crowdsources death sentences for random Pakistanis who are deemed to have breached the social or the moral, religious or moral codes of the country. This little guy, you see him in the cartoon, he's going around swiping right, and people are, voting for people to lose their lives. Now, it's a very dark piece of art, but it's brilliantly done. And it's only 15 minutes long. I'd recommend you look at it. It's on YouTube. And again, just testament to, this country that on the one hand faces these huge challenges, and yet on the other hand has these enormous stores of resilience and invention and, brilliance. And these were all things that drew me to it while I was there and have kept me interested now.
Terrific. Thanks, Declan. That's a fantastic introduction, and it's always nice to get a candid behind the scenes look at how a book came together, right? And sort of the structural elements. I wanted to start off asking you a few questions, then I'll take questions from the Q&A chat box. The book you describe what is sort of like a rogues gallery of really colorful characters, and some of these people are just objectively noxious people, and yet you craft modestly sympathetic, sort of textured accounts of your interaction with them. So I wanted to start by asking, not who is your favorite rogue, but who was the most sympathetic of these rogues that you chronicled, whose stories you chronicled, and then to an extent, how did you grapple with the challenge of wanting to build rapport with someone, wanting to understand their story, recognizing that there's always a mutual exchange in this kind of journalism and storytelling, but at the same time, recognizing the sort of their full character. So if you could share one of those rogues with us, that might be a nice way to start.
Well, I would say, I'd say Anwar Kamal, who I just spoke about, was definitely someone who was a very complicated figure, because he was loquacious and funny and incredibly blunt about what would go on. And he had this incredible turn of phrase. He would sort of, as I say in the book, he had this very typical lack of precision in the way he spoke. So he would say things like, "Oh, that's my guard. He killed 5, 6, 7 people," and so on. And he also, brought me almost directly witnessing things that were really sometimes a little bit on the edge, I think, of what you'd normally get to see. He brought me one time. I remember he brought me to see to witness a tribal jirga, a meeting, a sort of a tribal council, if you like, and it was to discuss the fate of 2 young men who had been kidnapped from another area because they had this feud with this other area. The other people had kidnapped some of their Merwits, and the Merwits had kidnapped these 2 young guys when they were traveling on a bus like a year earlier. And I was sitting at this meeting and they were talking about these 2 young guys who were just sitting beside me, and it was definitely like a little challenging. It felt amazing to be there as a reporter, but also, it felt a little bit odd to be there, kind of under the wing of a person who was involved in this kind of hostage taking, effectively, So, I will say, he was certainly one of the more, someone that I felt quite drawn to. And when he died eventually, I had a real sense of loss. But, I will say one other thing, it wasn't just, there's certainly quite a few rogues in this book, you're right. There are also some heroes like Asma Jahangir, the human rights activist. She was somebody I knew really quite well. I met her regularly when I was there, when I was in Pakistan. And, here was this person who was, her work was morally unambiguous, I would say. She was a vociferous critic of the military. She represented the downtrodden, the people that other lawyers would not represent. She stood up for minorities, and really was honestly one of the most fearless people I've ever met in life. But even Asma Jahangir was no saint even by her own reckoning. She had made a lot of compromises in her life. She could be a hard character to deal with sometimes. And so, in the book, I think one of the things I tried to do was to show that the people who did really morally questionable things also had a kind of an appealing side, and the people who were doing some of the greatest work in the country could also have a rough edge. And then there were people, some of the people I've written about really fall, I think, squarely in the middle. I mean, there's a chapter devoted to Salman Taseer, who was the governor of Punjab, who was assassinated by his own bodyguard in 2011 because Salman Taseer had stood up for a Christian woman who had been sentenced to death under the country's blasphemy laws. So Salman Taseer was this man who, up to the point when he took the stand for this Christian woman, was had what we would call a very colorful personal and political life. He had made a lot of money. He was known in Lahore for being kind of obnoxious to people. He was very blunt. He had been politically active, and he had been jailed under the military dictatorship in the 80s, but he'd also been in many ways a political opportunist. He'd made some bad moves in his career. But he had amassed no shortage of enemies, but he did take the stand. He did take this very public and courageous stand for this Christian woman that ultimately cost him his life. And for me, those are, as a journalist, those are the kind of people that you want to write about, because they reflect an essence of life as we all live it, which is that it is complicated. And as a writer, it's not much good if you're a reporter to write a story saying, oh, actually, dear reader, this is complicated. That's not good enough. Our job is to make sense of things. But when you're writing something that's a little bit longer, it gives you a little bit more leeway to try and flesh out some of these ambiguities and hopefully bring the reader with you.
I have to say, I loved your portrait of Asma Jahangir. You knew her much better than I did. I also have memories of her sharp tongue and of needing to launder my clothes every time I was around her, because she smoked more than most any human I've ever met. She's someone who has, I think, been canonized in a sense by the legal establishment for her bravery, but I thought you really captured kind of an inside view of what she wrestled with and the trade-offs that she felt she had to make. And the book is full of that kind of really insightful moral ambiguity, if you will. I don't want to spoil the end of your book, but you do sort of wrestle throughout the book with the Pakistani state's obsession with Balochistan. And I was wondering, as you step back and as the years receded from the time that you were expelled, and you began to sort of put the threads of the story together, and it traced back to Balochistan, how does it make sense to you that an insurgency that by most objective measures does not threaten the integrity of this powerful military-led state would become such a neuralgic issue, and in fact more neuralgic to state than the other issues you reported on, nuclear weapons and internal security threats of other kinds?
Yeah, I mean, I think I didn't appreciate, you've summarized that very well, and I think I didn't appreciate just how neuralgic Balochistan was for what's broadly known as the security apparatus in Pakistan, the military, the intelligence services, the politicians who support them. I didn't appreciate just how sensitive that was till I got a little bit of distance from the country and from the story. And and as you say, I ultimately realized it played a role in my own expulsion. I think it comes to a couple of things. One is that Balochistan is quite simply this huge, geographically huge area that covers 43% of Pakistan's landmass, and most of it is uninhabited. It's mostly desert, but it is strategically incredibly important, and it's on the border with Iran, it's on the border with Afghanistan, and it's always been this place that has been that the Pakistani state and other actors in that area have used for their own purposes. It is a transit route for people who make fortunes from drug smuggling. It has always been a place that has harbored militants. And it has also been this province whose people, for the most part, not all, but who mostly have been kind of reluctant Pakistanis right since the beginning, since 1947. Balochistan, or at least part of Balochistan, was what was known as a princely state in the pre-partition era. And it only acceded to Pakistan in quite controversial circumstances in around 1948. And, ever since then, there have been these recurrent insurgencies led by mostly Baloch tribal fighters against the central state. And so by the time I got there, when I arrived in Pakistan, just as the fifth insurgency in Balochistan was taking off, and I think it was sensitive for the military, as you say, disproportionately sensitive for the military for two reasons. One is pretty straightforward. It's this idea that the military saw the insurgents as being supported by India in some measure. And that is always, a neuralgic issue for the Pakistani establishment. They saw that the Indians were stoking this insurgency to some degree as payback for Pakistani support for insurgents in Kashmir, in Indian-occupied Kashmir. And so, it got to this idea that the Indians were behind the troublemakers. It also got to this idea that it was this very sensitive area, particularly sensitive area at that time, because you had in northern Balochistan, the Afghan Taliban sheltering under some form of cover from the Pakistani state and carrying out attacks inside Afghanistan against American and NATO forces. So it's this area where the Pakistani government or the security forces did not appreciate any sort of outside scrutiny. And this insurgency that started up, the fifth insurgency, was bringing the kind of scrutiny they didn't like. And then I think, the other reason for why Balochistan is so sensitive is a kind of historical, psychological reason. Pakistan is this country, as I say, where Balochistan has been a reluctant part of the country, but is by no means the only part of country where the regions have chafed against the center for decades. You just have to remember that until 1971, Pakistan was composed of two wings, the present-day country and an entire other country, in a way, which was then known as East Pakistan, eastern wing of the country, now Bangladesh. The war that led to the secession of Bangladesh in 71 was such a huge trauma for the country, for its idea of itself, for the notion that Pakistan is this homeland for the Muslims of South Asia. Suddenly it turns out, well, a whole part of that homeland has just broken off and done it, forged a new country in really acrimonious circumstances. So I think that you're absolutely right, Josh. The insurgency in Balochistan, even at its height, never posed any really significant threat to the military. But you had this military that is dominated by an officer corps that is largely from the Punjab, and you have people in Balochistan who have this right, who feel that they see the army as a quasi-colonial force, and the army, for its part, sees the Baloch or the Baloch nationalists as troublemakers, and they, in the back of their minds, they are neuralgic about this idea that the Baloch, could eventually, or that any part of the country could try to break away. So, it got to this idea that the conflict in Balochistan, while militarily not super significant, really struck at the heart of this identity issue of what it means to be a Pakistani.
Thanks. I just have two more questions, then we'll open it up, and I'll read up some of the questions from the Q&A. So two questions briefly. One is, you've reported from many parts of the world. You're now in Nairobi. You reported from Egypt. You did work in Syria, and you talked a little bit about why Pakistan, and for cultural and other reasons, provided an environment where you could get access to some of these kind of figures during an important time in Pakistan's modern history. But I guess my question is, how special is Pakistan really? Or, you know, as a political scientist might approach this, you know, what were there structural differences in the way that you saw the Pakistani state or the Pakistani society respond to big shocks to its system? In this case, you know, the sort of religious and insurgent upheaval that were different from what you've seen in other places that have some of the, you know, that have experienced some similar shocks. You know, what was really different about Pakistan with the benefit of hindsight of having seen Syria and Egypt and many other places?
So my most immediate frame of reference is Egypt, where I've lived for the last 5 years. I just moved to Nairobi recently. And in some respects, Egypt has a lot of similarities with Pakistan. It's a Muslim majority country. It has a history of military domination. You know, in many respects, it looks quite similar. But, you know, I guess the difference is there were a number of, when I arrived in Egypt from Pakistan, I kind of, as one tends to, you start to grapple with the country, partly initially through the frame of where you've just come from. And there were a couple of things that struck me. One was that the relationship between the people and the state is very different in Egypt and in the Arab world, actually, than it is in South Asia and in Pakistan. Partly this is to do, I think, with the diversity of South Asian societies. You know, Egypt is a country where everyone is the majority of people are Muslims. It does have a significant Christian minority, but people they're almost all Sunni Muslims, and there are not the same kind of differences as Pakistan has, the same different groups as you have in Pakistan. And secondly, you know, Pakistan is ethnically so different, geographically so different, and it has a sort of for those reasons, the military, even though it has always played a strong role in the state, has never been able to exert the kind of total control that you have seen in many parts of the Arab world, at least until 2011. So, you know, Syria, Egypt, you know, even Yemen, I mean, many other, obviously the Gulf countries. You know, these are places where in the post-colonial period, the state, you had one part of the elite that was really able to capture the state. And in Pakistan, if you look back over the history, because as I say, it's had these so many different fault lines since its foundation, even in the, you know, at the height of General Zia's rule in the 1980s, when, you know, the Pakistani military was fully aligned with the United States fighting in Afghanistan, when Zia was largely unchallenged, you know, the ISI, the military, the intelligence services were incredibly powerful and growing. Even then, the military needed buy-in from local leaders, from a section of the political class at least, and so on. And so to my mind, that's one of the characteristics of Pakistan and probably of other South Asian countries as well, that, you know, there is this, even in moments when democracy is not even nominally functional, there is a kind of, there is an impulse, there is a sort of democratic impulse, you know, that where people are forced, where you know, there are other forces that challenge the dominant force for control of society.
Looking forward to being able to ask you that question again after you've spent a few years in Nairobi working across Africa. One more quick question, and then I want to turn to the Q&A. We have some students who have joined us today, and, you know, I always like to unpack how you do what you do as a journalist without revealing any special journalist secrets. You know, how do you prepare for meeting some of these people described in your book? You know, when you go out to far-flung places in the country, what sort of preparation do you do? What do you and then what do you do afterwards to try to triangulate what it is you have heard? You know, what goes into making these kind of interactions worthwhile or making sense of them?
Yeah, so I mean, I read a lot, obviously. Some of the people that I dealt with didn't have a lot of source material that you could look up, but there were many who had been written about extensively, or that I could speak to other people who could give me a sense of what they were about before I went to see them. So that was enormously helpful. You know, when I'm dealing with people like that, I try to, you know, within the constraints of the job, and it really just depends what story you're writing for a newspaper at that point in time, how much time you have. But I try to work in a little bit of time where you, you know, you pay attention to what they say, but you also pay attention to, you try and build in some time to witness what they do, what their interactions are like with the people around them. I find that like incredibly helpful to try and get a sense of who they are. I also find as a reporter, you know, you cannot take enough notes, especially often when you're on the road. You know yourself, it's exhausting, right? There's a lot of the interview with your subject is only really often a very small part of the day. A lot of it is about getting there, the logistics, you know, the introductions, the meals, all of that. And then by the end of the day, you're often pretty exhausted, but it really helps to carve out half an hour in every day or even more, just to write down almost off the top of your head, what were the strongest impressions you had from that day? Those kind of notes that often in the moment seem kind of obvious to you because you've just gone through that experience are like gold at a later point. And, you know, not just a week later, but sometimes you come back to those notes a year later, and they are actually the thing often that will distinguish your reporting from someone else who might have covered the same thing. And then lastly, I think you get to an excellent point about how do you fact check people effectively. You know, people will say outlandish things to you, or if you've got them, if they really trust you, you know, they'll let their guard down. And depending on what their standards of accountability are, whether these are people who are worried about whether they're going to be, you know, hauled up on it or not, they might they might run their mouths or say things that, you know, don't bear scrutiny. And so, you know, often it just takes in the book, I suppose, particularly when I was pulling material for the book, there's scene and color and things like that that you witnessed that really there's no issue about. And then there are claims that people will make, or there are facts about their lives. And I'm afraid a lot of that is just very, you know, straightforward spade work, really. It involves, you know, trying to talk to as many people as possible about the same thing and literally triangulate the truth and go back. You know, there's no great magic to it, but it's really just about trying to dig under the surface. And, you know, I would also say, if you feel you're going to, sometimes, you know, in your writing, you may feel you want to make a judgment about something, which is fine, especially when you're writing a book. But I always find it's useful rule of thumb to think that if that person who I was writing about was sitting in front of me and I were to say this thing to them, even if they were to object to it, how would I defend it? You know, and I often find that's a useful rule of thumb for a writer anyway. I mean, it's different if you're a scholar or a researcher. I understand a political scientist, it's a different structure. But as a writer, sometimes we find ourselves trying to make judgments about people or about situations, and it's very useful. It's a useful litmus test to think, how would I defend it if I had to in front of that person?
That's great. No, that's really helpful. And, you know, I recall some of the most colorful people I interacted with in Pakistan would, you know, would lie profusely, and so the challenge was comparing their lies last time to their lies this time, and you know, trying to piece together a full story. And you pieced together some remarkable stories about characters in this book. I want to turn to some of the questions in the Q&A, and the first one I think is a great opening question by Professor Vikram Nehru, who asks, what worries you most about Pakistan's future and why, and what gives you the greatest hope?
You know, I think when I was there, it's funny, when I was covering the country, the big, and when I met you actually, and you were doing your research, especially in the Northwest, a lot of the fear around the country at that time was about the Taliban insurgency. And now, with the benefit of hindsight, I think that, historically, the greatest challenges to Pakistan have been about the country's internal integrity. It has fought wars against India that it has lost several. It had the breakup with Bangladesh and with East Pakistan in 1971. And even now, I think that these issues of the structural and political integrity of the country have got to be an ongoing concern. I mean, of course, there are immediate concerns about from the US government perspective, for instance, the US government obsesses about Pakistan's nuclear capability and whether their nuclear weapons could fall into the wrong hands. I think those are clearly important things, but honestly, I'm not sure that I ever feel particularly well equipped to make a judgment about what sort of immediate threat those things face. But I think that if you look at it in the broader arc of history, you see that at the heart of Pakistan is this question of identity, of what it actually means to be a Pakistani. What is the relationship between religion and the state? And also, how should the country be run and who should be in charge? These are basic things that are contested in many countries, but it is striking in Pakistan that 70 odd years on, these things are still vividly contested between Pakistanis. And so it seems to me those are the forces that threaten to not necessarily pull the country apart tomorrow, but really do pose a threat. When we look at other countries that have tumbled into serious strife, you often see that these are the kind of factors that lead to it. On the other side of the equation, as I said, I see in Pakistan, so many people I met when I was there were individually people of such, it's so impressive. I mean, people who humbled me, not just by their courage or initiative, but also people who were, dedicated to trying to find a way to forge a different path for their country. There's a sense in which that's a somewhat pat thing to say, and that often reporters or foreign correspondents, they go to other countries and they will say that the people were generous. Well, in my experience, people are generous in most cultures, and there are smart, able people everywhere. But really in Pakistan, I often felt that there was this, huge contrast between the often, turbulent circumstances of what was going along and some of the extraordinary people I met. And, I just pointed to that, animated short film I saw earlier. But again, for me, it was just another small example of, the great potential in the country to really turn it around if the circumstances could allow that.
There are a few questions about Pakistan's intelligence services. I know you had your brushes with them. What were you surprised by, or what matched or didn't match your presuppositions about the role or the priorities or the manner in which the Pakistani intelligence services operates? Is they consume a large part of the public narrative about how the Pakistani state functions.
I learned a couple of things about them, and I think probably about the intelligence business in general. One of the striking things I learned was that when I was there, there was it was part of a broader movement, I think, in the intelligence community in the world, that they were starting to open up a little. In Britain, MI6 was starting to speak. There was a time in Britain when you couldn't even say MI6 in public, and at that time they started to engage with the press. I think similarly in the US, the intelligence services were opening up in that period. And in Pakistan, the ISI appointed a sort of spokesman. It was someone who we met, So my job often involved, going to meet with this person, often in the really vain hope of trying to eke out any piece of useful information from him. Because as you said, when you're talking to people and you realize they're telling you one falsehood after another, it just becomes sometimes an exercise in futility. But, he was actually this quite personable man. We had a lot of chats, and, I really, I realized that, we would often go to them to check the most, not scurrilous, but strong accusations that were made against the ISI. Are you supporting this, or are you responsible for that bombing? And his job was to brush these things off and scoff at them. But I realized that more broadly inside Pakistani society, this reputation for being omnipotent and being behind every bit of manipulation that went on in the country, or perceived manipulation, was actually part of the power of the ISI inside the country. So many people believed that the ISI was capable of anything that became, even when that was not necessarily the case, it became part of the strength of the agency to exert influence and shape the course of events. And then, but the corollary of that was that actually the ISI, in many respects, was not as impressive as it liked to make itself out to be. It's not a professional service like some of the Western ones, because it is staffed by military officers who rotate every number of years, or is led by these military officers. It has a permanent secretariat or permanent service of civilian employees and some military, but it is not as professionally competent as some of the services that it likes to hold itself out against. It does rank, I'm told by intelligence specialists, from other countries, that it ranks very favorably in the region. It was, at least until recently, considered to be a more accomplished intelligence service than its Indian counterpart, for instance, the research and analysis wing. But on the ground, I had friends who were being harassed by the ISI who, for various reasons, and they told me these stories of these guys who would ring them up and say, "Oh, gee, sir, please, could you just give me this detail about you, because we can't find it for you?" And my friend would say, "Well, that's your job to find it out. Why should I tell you?" And these sort of absurd conversations would take place. But really, I guess that I think the most important thing to realize about their role in Pakistani society is that they have made some huge, whatever their competences at the micro level, at the ground level, and they are a combination of being a bit plodding and actually very efficient in some respects. They're very good at picking people up off the streets or finding people in their homes. They're very good at intimidating journalists. They're very good at exerting pressure on politicians. But whatever about their competences at that kind of operational level, at the broader strategic level, because of the historical hand Pakistan has been dealt, the service has had this great power certainly since the 1980s. And because there's been relative impunity and lack of oversight, it has the strategists in charge have taken decisions that I think have been very questionable and flawed, and at a strategic level really had some very negative consequences for the country. And I think, in a way, away from the questions of what happened in this instance and that instance, in the broader picture, I think that's the most salient critique to make of their work.
You were in Pakistan during a very tumultuous period, and you saw changes to the political fabric and the social fabric, and you saw in many ways, you sort of alluded to the fact that outsiders, Westerners, certainly Americans, were really concerned about the rise of religious extremism within the country. There has certainly been a kind of retrospective look at this period from policymakers here in the United States and elsewhere, who say, look, I think we either didn't understand what was going on, or we overreacted, or we misdiagnosed what role outside countries could have in shaping Pakistan's social fabric or its political stability. From your time there, what sense do you have about what you could speak to Americans in particular? You have the benefit of not being one. What Americans got right and what Americans got wrong in engaging Pakistan during this very chaotic period in its history?
I think, in broad terms, American policy or government officials, policymakers, ultimately came to this realization that, Pakistan is this country that after 2001, I arrived there 2004, so of course things were still pretty fresh then. On the political front, you had Pervez Musharraf and George Bush, who were self-proclaimed best buddies, I think was the term, or Bush called Musharraf his buddy. And Pakistan, showed that it was, said all the right things about cooperating with what was then known, of course, as the War on Terror, and it rounded up a lot of people who ended up in Guantanamo, in jails in Guantanamo, and appeared to be an ally in the United States. But while I was there, I really saw the strains in that relationship becoming apparent, because I think American policymakers yet again came to the realization that Pakistan is this country with which the two countries have periodically had or appeared to have shared interests, but they often have really under the surface diverging values, or actually their interests are, or rather I would say they appear to have shared values, or they proclaim to have shared values, but they actually have diverging interests, and I guess for America, the frustration was that American officials came to the realization that, as one of them said to me, I remember, ultimately a lot of Pakistani behavior is dictated by its relationship with India. That is the core tenet of strategic thinking that dictates Pakistani behavior, obviously in Kashmir, but also in the way that it has comported itself in Afghanistan, and actually more broadly across the region. Now, it's not the only reason, and as you know, there are many other strands to Pakistani behavior as well. But I think that certainly for American leaders, and in fact, I quoted with permission Ann Patterson, who is the ambassador, during a part of this period, and we were sitting in her office, and we were talking about the latest thing that the Pakistani military had done that seemed to be sort of counterproductive, or hard to understand. And she just turned around and she said, the thing about this country is that it really comes down to India. And for me, that was, it's a sort of simple truism if you look at Pakistan and the wider historical arc, but it was a very useful way of figuring out, as I said, why internally, for instance, the insurgency in Balochistan was prosecuted with such vigor because there was a perception of Indian help, a perception that, it has to be said, wasn't entirely invalid either. I just don't think it was the driving force behind this insurgency. And similarly, in terms of the great frustrations of the Americans and the Brits and other countries with Pakistani policy towards Afghanistan. So I think the book, to some degree, lands at the end in India. I did not have a chapter sort of about Kashmir or the conflict in Kashmir, but I do come to it, and I come to the broader relationship with India at the end. And without getting too sort of historical about this, you realize that there is a scar that was driven deep between these two countries at their birth in the late 1940s, and the unresolved business of that period is still playing out now. And I think that's for me at least, that was an idea that helped me to reconcile some of the kind of contradictions that I saw in the country.
There's a question about whether you considered including more profiles of women among the 9 lives, or maybe to extend that, those who are socially marginalized. How did you think about choosing these characters, or sort of what went into that calculation for you?
Well, there is a chapter on Asma Jahangir, and there's also quite a strong focus on Benazir Bhutto in that chapter, and actually across the book. I've met her a number of times, and she was this again another larger than life character. The choice of the people, the 9 lives were not necessarily chosen to be representational of the country. It's a little bit of a self-made trap in the book, because it's called the 9 Lives of Pakistan, but it doesn't necessarily set out to be a sort of complete portrait of the country, which would be impossible. And there were so many people that I could have looked at, but I guess I was drawn to people. Partly, I was drawn to people who were who I'd had a lot of experience with, and that I felt qualified to write about. They were people who, in large part, played a role in some of the big events that were going on during that period. But one of the things I tried hard to get into the book, and I'm not sure I entirely succeeded, was to really write as much as I could about the social and cultural fabric of the country. And in fact, I did at one point draft a chapter about a sort of pop actress in the country. And I actually wrote a chapter, and in the end, it just I didn't have what I needed to make that work inside the book. But she was this very colorful person who I'd met and who had a very dramatic story as well. So there were there were a lot of difficult choices when I was pulling the material together. And there was a lot of material that fell on the cutting room floor. But in the end, I guess I was driven by the dictates of the storytelling and of the need to kind of marry this idea of telling the story of the power people who were prominent during that period. And that's really why I guess Asma Jahangir and Benazir Bhutto were, among women, were really, I think for me anyway, two people who really stood out. I mean, I'd been thinking about this. One book on Pakistan I've really enjoyed over the last year was the book about Kandeel Baloch that was written. Kandeel Baloch was this, as some people will know, she was this social media star in Pakistan who came up around the time that I was leaving or after I left in 2013, 14, 15, and then died in terrible circumstances after her own brother killed her. But there's been a brilliant book written about her by Sanam Maher. And that, for me was a wonderful vehicle for telling a story about Pakistan, through that young woman's life, but also kind of in the next era that followed from the one when I was there.
I just have one more question. So I pieces together some of the questions of the Q&A, and then any closing comments you have. One of the paradoxes that runs through your book, and I think other books on Pakistan, is that Pakistan presents as a strong state and also as a weak state. And you have this chapter about or this piece where you talk about Abdul Rashid Ghazi and this really sort of incredible insurgent movement right in the heart of Pakistan's capital. And it's really striking just the kind of the lethargy with which the Pakistani state engaged a threat to its own, not only its own territory, but its own narrative in the heart of the state. And in other places where you document the kind of what seems to an outsider like the sort of irrationally harsh use of the military. How do you, with the benefit of perspective and having served in Cairo and elsewhere, how do you think about Pakistan as a strong state or a weak state? And did you see that really change or evolve in any meaningful way during your time in the country?
I think I saw it as a very lopsided state, where power was concentrated in certain areas and to the detriment of others. When the siege at the Red Mosque started that you spoke about and Abdul Rashid Ghazi, the cleric, rose, when I look back on that now, I mean, it was a turning point in the modern history of the country, I think, arguably, because it was the first moment when the conflict between the state's support for Islamist militancy and its desire to be a different kind of country really sort of clashed violently right in the middle of Islamabad. But more than anything else, Abdul Rashid Ghazi and his ilk, those people, they pose a challenge to the story about what Pakistan is. And the state, because it is divided, or is divided, failed to come up with an answer to that narrative. The point about there are extremists in every country, in every society, but the key thing is, what is the role of the state in mediating those conflicts? And does the state present itself as a neutral body in trying to resolve issues or as a neutral forum for the resolution of ideological differences or other forms of conflicts? And in Pakistan, because the very notion of who should be running the state and what it represents was kind of contested, the state was unable to provide an answer to the questions that Abdul Rashid Ghazi posed. And, you know, his success came, as happens with many extremists, because he was able to provide a very simple narrative. He said Pakistan is a country that was formed for the Muslims of South Asia, and in fact, as part of a broader movement to create a caliphate. And, you know, we are merely implementing that vision, and that is all right-thinking Pakistanis should agree with us. And if they don't, well, they've got it wrong. And, you know, I had a lot of conversations with him, who again was someone who, on the one hand, was quite charming. On the other hand, he had these, you know, quite alarming ideas. But he provided this idea that for a lot of people suddenly made sense. And I think, you know, that is the thing about the Pakistani state, is that it has been very inconsistent at mediating these conflicts and in providing a simple answer to some of the questions that its own people have posed about what it should be or where it's going. Was there something else you asked me that I've forgotten to address there?
No, that's that captured it. You know, it's not a happy place to end the conversation, but I think it's an insightful one, because it's a thread that runs through your book, is that, you know, what makes Pakistan complicated and interesting is not just the sort of material tools of power at the hands of the state or of various political or social actors, but the contested narrative, and that the narrative remains contested and remains, you know, used by the state and by these other people whose stories you chronicle. So this has been terrific. I'm grateful for your time. I would encourage all of you to go out and buy the book. It's a page turner. It's not a dense academic book by a Pakistan scholar, and you should be grateful for that. It's one that is really illuminating, and I think sheds a lot of light on the struggles that Pakistan is going through at the present moment. So Declan, we'll continue to watch your reporting from another part of the world, but thanks for taking some time here with us today.
It's great to be with you. Thanks very much, Josh.
Thank you all.